Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast, where we share the best practices we use to help our residential real estate investor clients automate their rent collection and get on with their lives. Check out the show notes at landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. This show is brought to you by Roost Real Estate Company Property Management. To learn more about the services we provide, visit investwithroost.com. Now, here's your host, Chris McAllister.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast. I'm Chris McAllister, founder of Roost Real Estate Company, and I'm here today with my co-host, Laci LeBlanc. Good morning, Laci.
Good morning, Chris.
So today's episode is for all of the accidental landlords out there. And what I mean by accidental is maybe you're somebody who tried to sell your home and just couldn't quite get the price that you wanted or deserved. Or maybe you're somebody who's sitting on a mortgage with a rate that's just so good that you can't imagine giving it up. Or maybe you just inherited a property and you don't quite know what to do next. However you got to owning that first property, I just want you to know that you're not alone. And a lot of people become landlords more by circumstance than by design. So the good news is that's often how some of the best investors get started. And that's why I've titled this episode, Residential Real Estate Investing 101, from Accidental Landlord to Intentional Investor. So let's dive in.
Yeah, Chris, I am not an investor, but I'm surrounded by investors, as we've talked about multiple times. But it's still kind of fascinating to me. How do most people who end up becoming accidental landlords become a landlord if they didn't really plan to or intend to?
Well, I think what's interesting is even if you never plan to, I think for a lot of people, that first property that somehow falls into their lap, for lack of a better phrase, just that becomes the spur or the impetus or fuels that ambition. Well, this worked out. This is kind of cool. Maybe I should do another one. But the key here is not every real estate investor starts out with a master plan. A lot of people just fall into it. Maybe they've got a house and they've got to move for a job and they can't get what they want for their house, or something's wonky with the market right now, the local market. Or maybe it's a situation where they've outgrown their starter house, their very first house. But again, maybe they got it during the pandemic or just after, and it's got a 3.5% mortgage rate that they just don't want to give up. And then, sometimes maybe parents or grandparents leave a property behind and there's an emotional attachment to it. And for whatever reason, in the moment, they just can't quite bear to sell it. And thousands of property owners start this way. And, honestly, Laci, you and I have talked about this. I sometimes think of the term accidental landlord to be a little bit disparaging, but I don't mean it that way, but I haven't really come up with something that sort of describes the situation any better. And really kind of what I want to talk about today is, how people who pick up a house turn it into a business and a strategy for building wealth that supports them for years and years and years to come. And what's just kind of cool about the whole situation is so many of us who got in this way, got into real estate, got into investing, it wasn't a master plan. It was just the circumstances. Something happened in life. We ended up with our first house, and then we ended up with another one and another one and another one. But in any case, what separates the successful investors who start with that one house and move on or stick with that one house for the rest of their lives? It's not luck, right? It is being in the right place at the right time. And there's one way to look at this. If you became an accidental landlord, congratulations. In my opinion, that's kind of lucky. But the thing that's most important and the thing that helps move people from accidental to more intentional is it's the decisions to start treating that house as an investment, not as a bother or a leftover. And that decision to start treating that house as an investment, that's the decision that changes everything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think for a lot of people who aren't in the investment mindset already, a house that they have that they've moved on from or that someone has left them can feel like a burden, right? Because it's not really, investing has never, I don't think, been easy, but it feels harder now even than it used to be. So I wanted to ask you, why does keeping that property and becoming an investor, how does that still make sense for people? And can you talk to us a little bit about why and how that's a good decision?
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I'm going to tell you, and I truly believe this, it's always a good time to be investing in real estate. The issue right now is there just are good deals, not just great deals, but good deals on the market. Good deals are just not on the market right now. We're in a cycle, we're in a season where more intentional or professional investors are sitting back. They're taking care of what they have. They're keeping their eye out for new opportunities. But the fact is, they're not seeing anything that gets them all excited to, jump on and spend money on. The beauty of being in the situation where, suddenly you have a house for whatever reason, whether it's the one you own or the one that somebody passed on to you, that's 90% of the battle these days. You've already picked up that house at a terrific price. You've already got, potentially great financing already attached to it. That's more than halfway to setting yourself up as an intentional versus accidental investor. Real estate still works, and it will always work because it's tangible. You can touch it, you can understand it, it's stable. Yes, there's ups and downs, but at the end of the day, there's a range, right? But it's essentially stable. You can touch it, you can drive by it, you can see it, you can improve it. And a well-managed property pays you in three different ways, right? You get the income from the rent that your tenant pays. You get the appreciation because the house continues to grow in value. And every single month that you use that rent payment to pay your mortgage, you're building equity. Maybe depending on where you are in that 30-year mortgage cycle, it's not a ton of money, but every dollar counts. So there's three things. There's income, there's appreciation, and there's equity. Getting that rent every month, the property just becomes more and more valuable over time. Right? Tenants are paying down the mortgage. You're building wealth, and it doesn't feel like a lot of money at first, but over time, and I'm not talking over a lifetime. Over 3, 4, 5, 10 years, you're going to build real wealth. And real estate rewards the long game, the long view, and it rewards patience. I'm not here to say that holding on to that house is going to suddenly double your money overnight, because it's just not. But it's going to be steady. It's going to be compound growth. It's going to build over years. You don't have to worry about timing the market. You just have to participate. You just have to be in it, right? And manage it wisely. And when you do, you get that magic thing that we talk about all the time, Laci, that mailbox money. And that's a sweet place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we say a lot, the only better time than now to invest in real estate was like yesterday. And I think it's important to point out that if you have a property that you purchased before and now you're moving on, or that somebody else purchased before and left to you, however you become this accidental landlord, it's like you started investing yesterday, because you got the deals of yesterday, you got the price of yesterday, because everything constantly goes up, right? So I think that's a cool thing to point out. But I do think that we talk a lot about mindset, right? And I think there's a huge mindset shift that you have to make from going to homeowner, or, owner of a home that was betrothed to you, to becoming an investor. Can you talk to me a little bit about that mindset shift?
Yeah, when you live in a home, Lacey, your decisions are always personal, right? You decorate for yourself, you upgrade when you feel like it, you fix the things that bother you. When you rent a property, you have to make decisions like a business owner, not like an owner occupant. So every choice you make has to go through one simple filter. Does this upgrade, does this improvement, does spending this money make the property safer? Does it make it, more durable, in that will it last longer? Or does it potentially make it more profitable because I can command more rent than I currently am with the house in the condition that it is? And that's the mind shift. You've got to start thinking of it like a business owner. You have to stop reacting emotionally, and you have to start managing strategically. You focus on preventive maintenance now instead of emergencies. You make upgrades that attract better qualified tenants, or tenants that can pay more money. You think like an investor running a small, steady business that works for you and not the other way around. You want that first house to be working for you. You don't want to always be working for that first house.
Yeah, for sure. We talk a lot about the neighborhood standard and, updating to the neighborhood standard or maintaining to the neighborhood standard. And somebody who is, three-fourths of the way through a kitchen remodel we didn't want to do because of a leak, we did make choices, based on the neighborhood that we live in, right? We're not going to we don't live in a super high-end neighborhood, so we're not putting in solid surface countertops and
Right.
So I think it always makes sense maybe to think about that, right? Because eventually you're going to sell or eventually you're going to do something with the property. But talk to me about how that kind of decision making factors into making a really good rental. Because I think a lot of, especially new landlords or accidental landlords who are doing this for the first time, think that they might have to go fancy to attract tenants.
I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions out there, and it's definitely a mistake I made when I first started investing in real estate going on 25 years ago. Tenants don't want, I won't say they don't want luxury, but they certainly don't expect luxury. What they want, what they demand, and what they deserve is reliability, right? They want a clean, safe, well-maintained home where everything just works the way it should work. That doesn't mean solid surface countertops. It doesn't mean jacuzzi tubs. It doesn't mean luxury plank flooring. It doesn't. It just means that everything works. It's safe. It's clean. It's reliable. Great tenants, care a lot more about the appliances. Do they work? If you're offering appliances, are they working? Is the lighting decent? Are there ceiling fans if appropriate? Things that don't cost a lot of money. And more importantly than that, when something does go wrong in the house, they want a quick response from the landlord. And they care about that far, far more than granite or solid surface countertops or the fanciest appliances. All they want is something that works. And a reliable home attracts reliable tenants. And a property that looks cared for tends to be cared for in return. If you're unsure if your property is rent ready, get a hold of a property management professional who can walk through that property with you. And I'm not necessarily talking about your real estate agent, the person that you would go to help you list and sell that house, but reach out or ask for a referral from that person to a property management professional so that they can give you real world advice, information, and knowledge about what tenants are looking for in your neighborhood. Sometimes getting a house rent ready is as simple as fresh paint, a deep clean, a couple of new light fixtures, right? It's certainly not a total remodel. I just want everybody to keep in mind, you're not living there anymore. And honestly, what you want doesn't really matter, right? What matters is what the renters are looking for.
Yeah, I think a lot of times I don't want to say cheap, but like less expensive options, right, are easier to take care of, right? So they're more affordable, but they also are more durable and they last longer. And
Right.
when it comes time to replace them, right, you're not replacing granite with granite, you're replacing laminate with laminate, or you're replacing, laminate flooring with laminate flooring versus hardwood. That's almost impossible to take care of.
Right.
You can tell I live in a 100-year-old house with wood floors that I have to take care of. But let's talk about finances and how some of these financial decisions come into play. How should a first-time landlord think about the financial side of things from that perspective versus, buying it and keeping it for themselves?
Well, I want to kind of keep it simple, okay? But I don't want people freaking out over the math or anything like that. A rental property brings in income, but it also has expenses. And what is left over is your profit, right? Let's say you collect $1,800 in rent and your mortgage, your taxes, your insurance, a reserve for maintenance and so forth. Let's say that adds up to, over the course of the year, $1,700 a month. Then you're making $100 a month, right? That may not sound like a lot, but it's $1,200 a year in your pocket. And in addition to that, again, your tenants are paying down your loan the entire time. So, yeah, you've got to know what your mortgage and your taxes and your insurance are. You need to talk to a property management professional about, what you should be holding back for maintenance and so forth. I tell people, at a minimum, if you're getting $1,800 a month, I would really like to see you be able to hold back $180 to $200 every single month in reserve, so that when something does go wrong, it's not a personal crisis to get it fixed and paid for. But $100 a month is great. That's the cash flow we call mailbox money. But even if you're just breaking even, right, you're still building equity. You're still setting yourself up for future income. That house is still going up in value, right? So real estate is about predictable returns over time. It's not about instant cash. And the best landlords among us, whether they have one house or 1,000 houses, they focus on consistent, you know, base hits, right? They're not trying to hit home runs every single time. They're taking the long view, they're playing their long game. And it's just such an incredible thing, if you're in a situation where, yeah, if you pick up a little beer money every month because your rental income exceeds all of your expenses, that's fantastic. But I got to tell you, if you're playing the long game and you're doing it for the right reasons, for wealth for yourself and future generations, gosh, breaking even, Laci, it's not a terrible thing.
I agree. Yeah. So you mentioned the expenses. I want to talk a little bit more about what people should plan for in terms of ongoing costs or surprises with maintenance. I think that's kind of a big unknown out there if you're not already a landlord, if you're not already an investor. So talk to me a little bit more in detail about that.
Well, there's five main expenses, right? You've got your mortgage, you've got your taxes and your insurance. And if this is a house that you have that you don't want to sell, chances are your mortgage, your taxes and insurance are all rolled into that monthly payment, right? The best case scenario, if this is a house you actually inherited, maybe there's not even a mortgage. Maybe you just have the taxes and insurance to deal with. So those are the big three: mortgage, taxes, and insurance. But the thing that trips people up and that they don't plan for appropriately is maintenance and, again, management. So again, the first three are obvious, but maintenance and management are where new landlords often get hung up. So you've got a budget for maintenance. So like I said earlier, roughly 10% of your rent every month should be set aside, put away in reserves, so that you've always got a cushion of cash. So when the water heater goes bad, it's not a household crisis, right? It's not a budget buster. You've already got that money set aside to take care of that rental. And if you don't do that, and you don't use that cash, either whether for emergencies or whether to do some basic improvements to maintain the property, either during a tenancy or between tenants, I just want to tell you, ignoring those issues, it doesn't save you money. Deferred maintenance may get you through the month, but it just delays the reckoning, and the bill's going to be much higher when it comes due than if you can take care of any issues that arise as they happen. And as far as management goes, a lot of folks, accidental landlords, they manage the property for themselves, and that's often fine for a while. But life has a way of making that harder, right? Most of us have jobs and careers and kids and families and friends and hobbies and everything else. And oftentimes, when you become an accidental landlord, if this isn't something that you've really worked at to get good at for a certain period of time, it can disrupt your life. So there's always a place for professional management, whether you have a single house or 1,000 houses. Nobody wants to get those calls at midnight. Nobody wants to have to, police lease violations. Nobody wants to have to unclog toilets, on Sunday afternoon. All that type of mental stress can add up when it happens. And that's where, I think that people should think about professional management, and that's where professional management earns its keep. But there's a cost to that, right? So a lot of companies charge a percentage of rent. If you're thinking about budgeting for professional management, I can't speak to what other folks do, but you should probably plan that there's going to be 10% of the gross rent's going to go to the management company each month, and there's probably going to be an additional fee for leasing a property and other fees like that. If you want to see what we do at Roost, if you go to investwithroost.com, we have our price for services list right out there where everybody can take a look at. So whether you pay a percentage or whether you pay a flat fee, did I say a fat fee? A fat flat fee, a fair
You did,
flat
you
fee,
did, but that's not necessarily accurate.
a fair flat fee. There is a cost, but you've got to balance that cost against being able to live the life you want to live, and not having to manage the property or the tenant relationships.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think we're of the opinion, obviously, that property management is really more of an investment than an expense. And I think that, we get a little nitpicky with the words there, but property management can really, having that in your corner, right, can really help to increase the value of your property over time by helping you keep an eye on things, preventative maintenance, by helping you get the right rent. But talk to me more about that. What exactly does a property manager do? What are you paying for beyond just collecting the rent every month, which seems simple in your mind. But then once you figure out how you actually manage a property, I think it gets a little more complicated.
It does. A good property manager is your operating partner. A great property manager handles everything from pricing and marketing to screening tenants to signing leases to collecting the rent to managing delinquencies to doing evictions, coordinating repairs, recommending updates, getting properties rent ready between tenants. I mean, a good property manager can basically do everything that's required to maintain and profitably operate a property. At our company, we see it as we look at the entire property management um, service offering, right, as being about relationships. And our goal, our uh, operating system at Roost Real Estate Company is we manage relationships. We don't just manage transactions, and we don't just manage problems. We keep communication clear. We enforce policies consistently, and we protect the property, and we protect the owner. I think this is a good time to mention, our fiduciary duty as licensed real estate brokers is to the owner. We also have a duty per state law to treat the tenants fairly and honestly, but we treat the tenants are our customers in the legal sense of the word, and our owners are our clients in the legal sense of the word. So I digress a little bit there, but what it comes down to is a great property management. When something breaks, they're going to already have people lined up to take care of something when it breaks, right? When the rent's late, they already have systems in place to identify it, see it, post, follow through, call them, God forbid, file an eviction. But a good property management company has already got systems in place to deal with what happens when the rent's late. And that type of structure, that type of professionalism gives you and your property predictable performance and stable income over time. And that professional manager, it's going to turn your property from potentially a second job for you that you don't want, that you don't need, that you shouldn't have to take, into a real investment. You'll notice I'll never say a passive investment, because I think I don't think passive income exists in the real estate business, but it's definitely going to keep it from becoming a second job.
Misnomer, I think is what we refer to that as.
Yes, yes, misnomer.
You mentioned keeping communication clear, and I think you hit on one of the main reasons that folks are reluctant to work with a property manager because they're reluctant to give up that control or kind of the insight they have into what's going on at their property, who's living in their property, being able to know what's happening in it. So I think communication and how Roost particularly communicates with our monthly owner statements and the updates that we provide, things like that are really important. I was reading the newsletter from, I think it was propertymanagement.com sent out the newsletter, and it was talking about how most of the landlords they survey wanted more communication from their property management company. They didn't feel like they were being bothered. So I think that you hit on kind of a big reason that some owners are reluctant to hand things over to a professional manager, but we also get a lot of people who are more than ready to hand things over to a professional manager. What's the biggest reason you would say folks go from self-managing as accidental landlords to utilizing a property manager?
I think most owners start by managing themselves to save money. I mean, I don't think it's any tougher than that. Especially if they've got a long-term tenant in the property that either they found or maybe it was a rental property that got passed on. But the only fathomable reason for, unless you can't find a good property manager in your market, but the only good reason for managing yourself is to save money. And I respect that. But eventually, our owners anyway, who sign up with us, they realize that the real cost isn't that monthly management fee. It's their time, it's their stress, and it's the cost of their mistakes, right? If you hire an experienced licensed property management business, you're benefiting from the fact that probably they, as investors and all the other owners that they work for, they've already seen hopefully all the mistakes that can be made, and they've learned from them, right? They're not repeating mistakes, they're learning from mistakes, and they're going to help you avoid making the same ones. Professional management reduces vacancies, it attracts better tenants, and it keeps maintenance costs under control. It also gives you back your evenings, it gives you back your weekends, your peace of mind, and that's really what I think our owners are paying for, right? They're paying for sanity, and they're paying for stability.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I did have another question about the long game, but I think we've talked a lot about how real estate is a long game. So I'm going to ask you instead, what are some of the biggest mistakes that new landlords make when they become accidental landlords?
Yeah, but you know how I love the long game, Laci. So just I just want to, you're right, we have talked about it, but I think it's worth saying again, the magic of real estate is compounding over time. I can't stress it enough. Every month that you pay that mortgage payment, what you owe goes down. The value of the home goes up, and you're just winning across the board. 5 years in, you might still see it, I guess, as a side investment, a side hustle, whatever. But within 10 years, that first house could be your most stable, valuable asset. And again, you don't have to have a dozen houses. You don't have to have 100 houses, right? Even one well-managed rental property that you control over your working life can add tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, to your retirement fund. And the key is to start managing it. Even if you're going to be an accidental landlord for the rest of your life and you're never going to buy another house, right? Start managing it intentionally now, because consistency over time beats timing every single time. So again, that's my pitch one more time for the long game, Laci, so forgive me. But to answer your question, most of the horror stories that we hear, they tend to revolve around the same handful of mistakes, right? They overprice the rent, right? They think emotionally, right? So even if the neighborhood rent, the standard for the neighborhood is $1,000, they think, well, that was a special house, grandma did this and that. Or, my kids grew up there and we loved the fact that we could see the bus stop from the kitchen window. That's not going to get you any more money. And to think that because this house is yours, and you're emotionally attached to it, that house is going to rent for $1,200 when every other house like it in the neighborhood is renting $1,000, is a common mistake. The other common mistake is that we see, and we talked a little bit about earlier, is ignoring maintenance and deferring maintenance and not investing in preventive maintenance. And the other thing that just kills people is choosing tenants based on a gut feeling instead of professional applications, professional screening. So many times we see, new landlords make the mistake that they meet somebody, they hit it off, and that person's got the first month's and last month's rent and a security deposit in their pocket in cash, right? So they instead of going through the due diligence of making sure that this tenant is going to maintain their end of the lease bargain and return that house at the end of the lease term in as good or better condition than when they moved in, that all goes out the window because, wow, there's $3,000 right here. This is great. We're going to be fine. And it never, ever ends well. But overpricing rent, choosing tenants on gut feeling, ignoring maintenance, all of that is preventable if you have the right systems and or the right people in place. You can avoid making every single mistake that we've seen so many other folks make, at least early on in their investing careers.
Yeah, and right people, right systems. You mentioned there's also a lot of really good technology out there, right? But figuring out the right rent, there are a lot of tools that you can use to help you, right? We use a market rate rent tool to help us figure it out, along with a lot of expertise from the people who've been in this business for a long time. We use Tenant Turner, and we use that folio, and we use Property Mill to keep things, instead of on a legal pad right in your office, it's all
Yeah.
in one place, and you're able to look at it and track it and get flagged when something needs to happen. And I think it's worth pointing out that access to these tools is available to everybody. But especially if you only have one or two properties, you're going to pay a lot more for
Oh my
access to
gosh.
these tools than you would to just pay for access to a good property manager who's going to utilize these tools and give you access to them, and foot the bill, honestly, or at least split the bill with all the other owners
Exactly.
on their roll. So
Yeah.
I think it's really important to point out that there are also, tools out there that can help with this. And by, utilizing some of those tools, either yourself or probably more effectively via a good property management company, a lot of these headaches, a lot of these mistakes can be avoided. Um,
It's funny, one of the things that we didn't touch on, or I didn't touch on, is the monthly bookkeeping and accounting. A good property manager is going to make sure that you've got excellent accounting that your accountant is going to be happy with, or you're going to be happy with if you happen to do your own taxes at the end of the year. You can get by so long on a spreadsheet and a checkbook, I guess, but that's the other thing that you should expect from professional management, even if the single property, are books that are correct and accountant ready every single month, and certainly at the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, this is entrepreneurship, really, right? This is a small business
It
for,
is.
if no matter whether you have one property or 100 properties, it's a business, and you have to treat it as such, especially financially. So I think that's a really good point. So if I'm listening to this and I have this property, either that I'm not sure I want to sell, I might want somebody left me, what is the first step for me listening to this who wants to get serious and start treating this property like an investment instead of, a side hustle or something, a burden, something we have to deal with?
If you want to get serious about, I guess there's two ways to look at this. I want everybody to be serious about that one house, even if it's the only house they ever buy. But if you've had any thoughts at all about becoming an investor or buying rental properties, and you get that first house, whether it's because the one that your family has outgrown or because somebody passed it on to you, having the house alone, as we said earlier, you're halfway there. Owning that first house is the hardest part. The next step is to stop treating it like a bother or a leftover, or a project or a burden, and to start thinking of it as a business and start thinking of it as a wealth generator. This, just because you decide to become an investor with this first house doesn't mean that you're going to drop everything and you're going to start flipping houses and chasing deals. And maybe you will. Maybe you'll get the bug, like so many of us have done, and this becomes something that you become incredibly passionate about. But it doesn't have to be that way. It just means that you do need to understand the value of what you have, and be intentional about managing it smartly and letting professionals help you. And again, that's what we do every day at our company. We probably have, if we were working with 300 odd owners, I would say a third of those folks only have one property, and they, half of them will probably keep it that way for the rest of their lives. But our job at Roost is to help homeowners become intentional investors. I don't want any accidental landlords. It just feels like a mistake waiting to happen, right? It seems like it's dangerous. It makes me nervous, but we want to help homeowners become intentional investors. And a good property manager, is going to strive to protect your property. They're going to strive to streamline your operations, and they're going to give you the confidence that your investment is going to perform well over time without any chaos. That's the dream. But that's what I want for you. And honestly, that's exactly what you should expect from your property manager. And this is a good time to talk about that. We're going to put it in the show notes, but if you want to download a free copy of our book called What to Expect from Your Property Manager, even if that property manager is you, we'll make that available in the show notes here, so you can take a look at that yourself.
Yeah, I think the point that I would like to make is that, a lot of people think that maybe they can't afford a property manager with just one investment property. They don't have the income to maybe cover it. But I think the question is can you afford not to have one?
Yeah,
Because it does have
that's
to at least you have to at least act as a professional property manager if you're not going to hire a property manager, right? So that takes your time. But I think that the point is, you have to treat this intentionally and like a business, and you have to be a professional about it, whether it's you or whether you're hiring somebody to do that for you.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that wraps up today. So I want to thank you all for listening to today's episode of the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast. And if you've been thinking about keeping a rental property or keeping a property that you own instead of selling it, or if you already own one that's sitting empty, I hope today's conversation will give you a clear picture of what's possible for you. Real estate doesn't have to be complicated or stressful. It just needs to be managed intentionally, and that's exactly what we try to do every day at our company. But again, if you want to learn more about how to make your property perform, you can download a copy of What to Expect from Your Property Manager. And you can also visit learnwithroost.com, and you'll find free resources, practical guides, a bunch of videos that'll walk you through everything from setting rent to working with a property manager. And when and if you're ever ready to take that next step, you can also schedule a free property management consultation with Gretchen Mitchell on our team. Does that wrap it up, Laci?
I think that does it.
All right, everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.